right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on leveraging procurement for cybersecurity resilience. This is the 9th webinar in our 10-part series on cybersecurity and digitalization with a focus on supply chain cybersecurity in the energy sector. I am Scott Morgan, Principal Consultant with Enernex, and I will help moderate today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Please note, this webinar is being recorded, as you heard in the announcement, I'm sure, and all participants have been muted. The recording will be made available after the webinar, along with the PDF of the presentation slides. We will be taking questions via the Q&A window, and we'll have time for a Q&A after the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into that Q&A window. Note, these questions are only shared with presenters and hosts. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll try to follow up with you and provide an answer afterwards. Today's event is organized through U.S. Energy Association's Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, AMP-UP program. The AMP-UP program is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And as I mentioned a moment ago, today's webinar is part of our 10-part series. The overarching goal of this series is to discuss the discuss the cybersecurity challenges associated with the expanding supply chain necessary to address multiple transformations in the energy sector, including integration of renewables, deployment of grid edge technologies, integration of regional markets, etc. In today's webinar, we'll hear from Jacob Phillips from the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, and Frank Harrell from Schweitzer Engineering Laboratory, SEL. Jacob is Senior Corporate Counsel at MISO in Carmel, Indiana. He has a unique role in managing legal affairs for one of the world's largest electric grid operators and played a key role in developing MISO's cybersecurity vendor management program. Jacob oversees a variety of corporate legal matters from contracts and cybersecurity compliance to intellectual property and dispute resolution. Frank Harrell is Vice President of Security for Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, which invents, designs, and builds digital products and systems that protect power grids around the world. So before I turn it over to them, just a quick reminder to our audience, please enter any questions during the presentation via that Q&A window. And if we don't answer them along the way, we'll have time after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jacob. If you would please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. So first, I'll start with a brief overview of who we are at MISO and what we do, and then I'll move on to discuss how we manage our cybersecurity and procurement within our organization. So MISO covers 15 states and a province in Canada. We oversee 75,000 miles of transmission lines and manage the bulk energy market, which is roughly $40 billion of transactions per year. We have 3 control centers, North, Central, and South. Our North Control Center is in Eagan, Minnesota. Central is in Carmel, Indiana. And our Southern Control Center is in Little Rock, Arkansas. Next slide. So this slide shows where we're situated among other system operators throughout North America. MISO is one of 9 system operators in the US and Canada, and we stretch from Canada to Texas. MISO is especially unique because we manage different system and weather conditions across a wide geographic range from Canada to Texas. Next. So our role as a grid operator is to make sure that the right amount of electricity is generated and transmitted to utilities reliably and at the lowest cost possible, 24/7, 365. We're similar to air traffic controllers in that we manage traffic, except we're directing traffic on the grid and not planes. Next slide. It's important to note that some of the electricity cybersecurity practices have really been driven by regulatory requirements. Federal and state regulatory entities have established baselines which require vendor risk assessments that have helped drive improvements, especially in vendor negotiations. But it's also important to note that these regulations are driven at the entity level. So we are required to assess entities cybersecurity positions instead of the actual solution level. Next slide. Next. So I'm going to acknowledge that, of course, things are different around the world. So I can only generally speak about what some utilities have implemented here in the United States and Canada, and what has worked as we have developed vendor cybersecurity assessment programs. But I'd like to point out four takeaways on this topic. First, early evaluation is important to ensure bids address cybersecurity requirements. Second, it's important to leverage established cybersecurity frameworks as global standards instead of creating your own. Third parties can assist with assessments to expedite evaluation. They have a lot of the tools that you need, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And fourth is develop a negotiation strategy, especially with vendors that do not advertise cybersecurity as a benefit to their solution. Next. So I'm going to start with acknowledging the fundamentals of a cybersecurity procurement program. The who, what, when, and how. Who, it should really be a cross-functional effort with the business area describing the need, supply management assisting with the RFP, IT evaluating and establishing the cybersecurity requirements, and legal to ensure that the agreement addresses those requirements. The when, absolutely do it early. Do it in the RFP, request for proposal stage, to put vendors on notice. It's important that they're on notice so that they can also plan budgets if they need to improve certain elements of their program. The what, use a cybersecurity assessment questionnaire to understand how the vendor can meet your requirements. Our regulators require that utilities assess cybersecurity risks associated with vendors. Instead of each utility developing their own unique vendor assessment questionnaire, the North American Transmission Forum, for us, has organized a team to develop one standard questionnaire. By adopting the questionnaire, our vendors developed consistent responses for their customers to make it easy on everybody. The how, identify critical versus non-critical vendors. A good rule of thumb is you'd consider a critical vendor if there's a sudden loss that this vendor, if they're not available or your solution is not available, it would cause a disruption in your system. Once you give a vendor a critical rating, then you also rate it as a risk factor of low, moderate to high, depending on which controls they can demonstrate that they are implementing. For example, if a vendor can demonstrate that they are ISO 27001 certified and agree to continue and maintain such certification, then that vendor is a low risk. Next slide. So this is our general process at MISO from a 30,000 foot level. You have to define the business need. What is the solution that you're looking for? And how is it going to connect to your system? The business area would supply that information. Then you go to the RFP stage, which supply management would assist with. That includes the cybersecurity questionnaire. You get that information. Information security, IT, evaluates it and compares it in response to our requirements. Then you enter the negotiation stage. Ideally, you have a template, information security template agreement that you would use for vendors so that they understand what you're looking for upfront. That would be included in the RFP stage. So based on what they have as controls, then you negotiate the differences. Then you educate management on the risk factor to your organization and whether that's acceptable. Management should be aware and should be the party to really accept that risk for the organization, because it would also help ensure that it's mitigated throughout your organization. Next slide. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important to leverage independent third-party assessments to expedite the process. And we have 3 different organizations that we rely upon, and I'm obviously not including names. But the government is a good partnership because it develops guidance and frameworks and regulations that can help be used to require compliance with vendors. Risk assessment vendors, these provide independent industry assessments and ratings. They have a broader view of the industry, so they help assess risk from that perspective, providing more insight. And then the monitoring vendor, it just continuously monitors and assesses the vendors to ensure that they're complying with your standards. They also include audits to periodically assess whether your vendor is complying with your requirements. It really does take a village, and this structure helps MISO thoroughly address risk exposure. Next slide. So these are the frameworks that can be relied upon. You don't have to go far to see that there are quite a few different frameworks that industry relies upon. The North American Transmission Forum is one that MISO relies upon. Lots of utilities across the United States got together, created one questionnaire, and certain vendors have even been pre-approved, like Schweitzer, for example, so that you know what vendor is already complying with all of these requirements anyway. Next slide. So it's important to develop a negotiation strategy, like I mentioned earlier, especially with vendors that do not advertise cybersecurity as a benefit to their solution. So a few points to take away from this slide. Engage leadership, and because their support behind your program really drives the negotiation. Upfront costs, yes, that the vendor might cost more upfront with better standards, but damages later are greatly exceeded if there is a breach. Also, it's important to challenge suppliers that disclaim or minimize liability. So even though they say that they do comply with cybersecurity requirements, if they're disclaiming all liability, if they breach that agreement, that's a warning sign. So beware of that. Offer incentives. Also work with regulators. Like I mentioned, also in the United States, our regulators have really driven the compliance with our cybersecurity requirements. We have to assess vendors for that. Therefore, vendors have to respond to our questionnaires. Otherwise, they cannot bid on our solutions, our needs. So if you don't have those requirements driving your program, they are helpful. And you might want to work with your government to establish those. Next slide. So largely in summary, plan, source, manage. It's a fairly simple procurement cycle. Plan your requirements in advance. Source, organize your operations, require patches, and then manage that procurement lifecycle by assessing service level agreements, especially with vulnerability management, and ensure that there's secure disposal of your devices at the end of use. And that's largely what I have to say. Yeah, our relationships with our vendors, especially the larger vendors, have really helped with assessing and managing vulnerability. If you require your vendor to notify you early on in the process if there's a vulnerability, you can work with them to establish a patch or mitigate it while the vulnerability is being resolved. So that's it.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Jacob. Frank, I'm gonna turn it over to you. If you want to share your screen.
You bet. And thank you, Scott and Jacob, excellent information. And, I hope to be able to dovetail on some of that and just provide a bit more context from the vendor perspective. So let me back to my initial slide. So, again, before I start into the slide, I just want to amplify what Scott said in Jacob's presentation content. We're really in a team sport here between the supplier ecosystem and the customer ecosystem. And, I'm going to borrow a quote that a colleague from Southern Company, the big utility in one of the big utilities in the Southern US made. Jennifer Couch was the Southern Company colleague that made it, but we're all suppliers to somebody, meaning that in many cases, the large suppliers are customers and suppliers to each other. And in turn, we are the customers of the utilities and other entities that we serve, and we serve each other. So it's really a symbiotic relationship, and we really don't have to look much further than the threat landscape that we all face today to understand just how important this relationship is. And I'll also start by saying that it has to be a layered defense. And contract language is really an important layer, but it's really, in terms of engineering controls, an administrative control. So it's not all that effective, and it definitely isn't effective as a standalone procedure or as a standalone control. It's one layer in a multi-layered risk control strategy. It must be that. It can't be anything that you rely upon, because what are we all going to do? And if there's a breach of that agreement is litigation, which is expensive, ineffective, takes years. And so the best thing is a tight, close coupling between the supplier and the customer base, two-way bidirectional communication, a collegial negotiation, and then a continual interchange of information. However, contract language is important. What I'm showing on the screen here is a book that really revolutionized manufacturing, something that we use the lessons learned from at SCL every day, called World-Class Manufacturing, the Japanese manufacturing techniques, lessons learned. And as you can see, it specifies that contractual requirements can drive improvement, and they do, and they definitely do in the cybersecurity world. It does so with SCL, it does so with every supplier, or they do so, and it's something that we all need to take to heart. And we're going to get into this, they need to be understandable and digestible and achievable, and we need to all collectively understand exactly what they mean. And sometimes that gets lost. And I know that Scott works hard to make their USAID guidance understandable, and Jacob definitely does at MISO to make their contractual requirements very accessible to all involved. So, as I mentioned, this is an administrative control, and it's something that really can't function alone, but it is a really important part of this multi-layered strategy. And we're going to get into some of the tools, and Scott touched on them in terms of risk assessment, audits, international standards, examination, and we'll talk about how to do that in some detail to make sure that you're not looking at something that doesn't actually measure risk, but is actually measuring something someplace else in the supplier ecosystem. But I try to distill it like this. It should be as simple as possible, this cybersecurity contract language or procurement language as a whole, but no simpler. And what I mean by that, and we're going to talk about just in a moment, some good model procurement language that the Edison Electric Institute puts out. It's free, it's on their website. However, there's some really technical detail in there about NIST standards, and it's quoting 853 and 861, and that gets really interesting in terms of understanding it and actually accepting it, especially if you're not in the US and the National Institute of Standards and Technology isn't something that you embrace as a national standard. But ISO 27001 and IEC 62443-4-1 do. So do the CIS controls, as Scott mentioned, or I'm sorry, as Jacob mentioned. And that is also something and that's the Center for Internet Security, the critical security controls, Those are available to anyone in the world freely, and they're translated into different languages. So those are accessible tools that you can provide to your suppliers as a benchmark that they can access. You know, if it's a small to medium-sized supplier, they may not be in a position to purchase necessarily or embrace 27001 or 62443 out of the gate, but the CIS controls are there for them, and that's something else that you can consider. The last bullet on this slide is the flow down to other suppliers. You know, really, if we have our first tier suppliers selected properly and secured properly, but the second tier and third tier suppliers, the downstream suppliers, are this opaque box, that does no one any good. And so we need to make sure that our procurement language flows down into the supply chain. What I mean by that is when you obligate your suppliers to live up to a certain standard, let's call it the CIS critical security controls, that should also flow down to make sure they're doing the same thing down into their supply chain. And that's how we basically raise the tide to float all boats. And it's really important today because we are facing threats from well-funded adversary groups, criminal and otherwise, that pose a real threat to the underpinning of the critical infrastructure and certainly electric power systems that we all rely upon. We're relying upon them today for this meeting. But you know, I talked about the true supplier partnership, partners in profit, partners in the business relationship. So you're not just driving to the lowest possible price and checking a box and moving ahead, but you really collaborate with suppliers, explain to them their expectations and let them tell you what they're not getting from this relationship, and then refine and calibrate it as we need to. So that's really important. Also is a trust but verify approach. And that's really, and I'll go back to that, you know, basically in this standard versus, for instance, ISO 27001 and IEC 62443, trust but verify. It's really important to visit a supplier to cultivate these lasting relationships, but to go on site and check out what the supplier is promising you when you can. Sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes the supplier is located, you know, globally, so you're definitely not going to visit every supplier site. And that's where the value of independently audited certifications come in. And that's the strength of ISO 27001. And again, and I'll say it one more time before we get into it in a slide, 62443, there you have an accredited certifying body sending auditors into the field doing that work for you. Again, that shouldn't be standalone. There should be other layers in there. But now you have at least the confidence that a third-party auditor has gone in and evaluated the controls that you believe are necessary. And that goes into a continuous assessment. It can never be a one and done. And anybody that tells you that, you know, you'll get into standards wars between or framework disputes, SOC 2 Type 2 is better than ISO because it's a point in time versus something else. It's not. They're all looking back to make sure that you have a functioning, effective security management or security development management system that is evaluated over time and that it is continuously improved, continuously monitored, supported by executive management. And those are really important things. And just as Jacob mentioned, and we're going to get into this here in a second, the NATF has actually produced its, for suppliers that don't have that NATF supplier questionnaire is really a great instrument to use to vet suppliers that don't have independently audited assertions, certifications, et cetera. And we'll go more into that. But it's really important in today's environment. Just yesterday, you may have seen the Cisco ASA firewall, you know, espionage campaign, forget what it's called, Arcane Door or something like that. It's really important to verify that suppliers have business continuity and mature practiced incident response plans in place. Now you get that confidence with these certifications that I talked about, but if not, yeah, there's more due diligence required. We'll talk about how to do some of that. Jacob touched on this, and that is to examine the external risk surface of suppliers and maybe your own external risk surface. There are a variety of companies that do that. Coalition, which is part of a cyber insurance apparatus, Security Scorecard, BitSight, Risk Recon, UpGuard. The list is, voluminous. Black Kite, I think, is another one. But there's some tools you could use today that I think are interesting. One is the URL on the screen. If you use that URL and then insert the domain name of the supplier or even your own entity, you're going to get a quick snapshot. Now, I'll say this. These services are not perfect. They do have false positives. However, they're much better than they were before. And quite frankly, I think for many of these, the misidentifying a domain or an IP address or something is becoming relatively rare. Now, we can argue with the rubric, with the scoring model all day long, and I think we all have our opinions on that. And there are some companies that feel these have no value. I don't ascribe to that belief, meaning that this is much like a home appraisal. You may not get in the home to value a residence, but if you see the outside of a home is dilapidated, it has an open, broken windows, et cetera, you can make a good inference about what is likely happening on the interior, because these services only look at the risk surface or they only look at the external surface, but they're still valuable. And those are two that you can freely examine, at least an overall score, and maybe understand, if you don't have any other sort of measurement apparatus, what you may need to ask that supplier about. Okay, have you looked at this? Because a supplier, for instance, for security scorecard, can go into the platform register and obtain their own report for free and fix the things that need fixing. So that's something else in UpGuard, at least gives you an external look. This is the EEI procurement language that I talked about. This is a good starting point to design your procurement language. However, and a lot of work went into this, a lot of cross-industry collaboration went into this. However, there are some clauses in there that are somewhat problematic for suppliers, and you're going to get negotiation on. So I would make sure that before you insert any language into a cybersecurity procurement or security NX or whatever you want to call it, it meets your regulatory needs, number one, and number two, you understand exactly what is being asked, and perhaps your own enterprise should implement those same security controls. And make sure that before you start listing a variety of NIST documents, that's not already, in terms of comply with this X, Y, and Z, that's not already subsumed in, as Jacob mentioned, in what the supplier is already doing with an independently audited certification. And we'll get into that. I'll caution you here. And you can get into this in that EEI procurement language. I would suggest not asking suppliers for sensitive internal documents. Business continuity plans, if they're written properly, contain a bevy of very sensitive information. I don't know what really good it does to collect that type of information and store it. What a supplier's concern is that it will be compromised on the other end. Yes, an NDA might be in place, a non-disclosure agreement might be in place, but do utilities, become victims of cybersecurity compromises? Yes. And what real value is that bringing, especially when there's an independently audited assertion that not only is the plan in place, but it's practiced and effective and mature. And similarly, you can get into really interesting discussions and negotiations if you're attempting to require a supplier of IT or especially OT products to immediately disclose vulnerabilities. Certainly, certain vulnerabilities need to be immediately disclosed, those that are being actively exploited, et cetera. But in general, a supplier's obligation to its broad customer base is to release a patch at the same time it announces a vulnerability, so it's not actively exploited. And getting into a tight timeline for all vulnerabilities, 7 days, 14 days, even 30, is impractical, and you'll find suppliers unwilling to commit to that, because actually it's counter to good security, it's counter to international standards, as you see on the slide, and it's something that needs to be reviewed for practicality. And is it really contributing to security? What I want to close with are, there's probably a misunderstanding of actually the depth and breadth of the international standards that large mature suppliers already certify to. They're independently audited to. They have auditors that come on site and ensure, for instance, the 62443-4-1, that these controls are in place and they're functioning and they're mature. There's even a maturity level assigned. if you see this, you can have some degree of confidence that the supplier secure development lifecycle process is what they purport it to be, and it's what you expect. And as Jacob mentioned, there are large utilities today that accept that out of the gate as a supplier vetting. In fact, a process, and in fact, NERC accepts that. There's ERO endorsed NATF guidance on the link that I show, or that I will show, that allows North American utilities to accept accredited third-party auditor work to satisfy their own internal regulatory risk assessment requirement. Another example, and I think of these as interlocking, is ISO 27001 is the entire enterprise. And then 62443 is, if you're looking at a Venn diagram, on the inside of that for the secure development lifecycle process. But ISO 27001 is transitioning to the 2022 standard. I have on the screen there the categories of controls. There were over 100, now they're going to be 93. But it really is a cradle to grave information security management system, basically assertion that you're doing generally what organizations need to do in order to be effective. But here's the big but. When you see these, look at the scope. When the supplier provides them, ask and understand the scope. The certificate and the report for 62443 is going to tell you if it's company-wide, if it's for a particular product line, if it's for a particular site. Similarly, an ISO 27001 certificate is going to, in the statement, will tell you what it's covering, but more importantly, ask and review for the statement of applicability. That'll tell you, because you don't have to be audited to all these controls if they don't apply. But you need to know, as an assessor of the supplier, what controls are in place, what did they say were out of scope, and if they're working out of scope, why? And so that's a really important part of a complete program like that. Now, Jacob already mentioned this. The site right now, I believe, is down for some restructuring. But this is how you get if you just go to natf.net, you can find it on there if it's not that link that I have on after they restructure it. But the Energy Sector Supply Chain Risk Questionnaire is another cross-industry collaboration that allows you to just pull down a spreadsheet, if you will, or it is a spreadsheet, and have a supplier answer that if they can, and if they can tell you how they're doing it, then you have a decent understanding, subject to audit, subject to third-party review, subject to your own assessment, that they are either mature or on their path to becoming mature. If they don't know how to answer any of the questions, then there's some work to do. And as Jacob mentioned, it requires additional vetting. And if they can't do it, it provides you the opportunity to either reject that supplier or accept the risk and use additional controls to mitigate the risk, the residual risk. And with that, I appreciate being able to partner with Jacob, and certainly I appreciate the opportunity with Scott and USAID and USEA to talk to you today. We'd love to answer any questions. And I think for both of us, if we don't get to your question, or there's something you don't want to ask in a group, we're happy to answer them individually. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Frank and Jacob. We have a few minutes here, so I'll jump in with some of the questions. Jacob, if you don't mind, I kind of wanted to start with you. So I think you mentioned in there about identifying your critical vendors, your key vendors. I think you did even say that you're looking at those vendors that supply assets and critical systems. The ones that if it's not operating, that things are going to be impacted within 15 minutes or whatever the North American standard is. Mm-hmm. Do you have a formal process that you go about identifying that, or is it kind of starting with the really obvious ones, looking at those critical systems?
That's a good question. Yeah, we research vendors, and there are several large players that provide those systems. Not enough of the variety, as some might say, but yeah, so there are critical players, and as I mentioned earlier, even NATF certifies certain vendors. If they've filled out the NATF questionnaire, they're listed on there. So that's a good place to start for evaluating who is advertising as a cybersecurity organization. So yeah, that's a good start. I'd recommend starting with NATF, their list.
Okay, great, thanks. I guess kind of a follow-up as well. So another one you talked about in the kind of process slide of starting with the business process and working your way down. I guess can you talk a little bit more about how you might translate some of the criteria in like an NATF assessment or some of the controls in one of those frameworks that we talked about into requirements in the actual RFP? I guess you're probably not just attaching, the entire, NIST framework at the end of an RFP and say, you use this. I mean, how do you get a little more specific maybe to what MISO actually needs?
Yeah, and as Frank mentioned too, you don't want to ask for more than necessary. So our information security department works with our business areas to assess what solutions we're looking for, the needs, the connection, what information is being shared with that vendor. And if we're not sharing certain information, certain sensitive information, or they're not connecting to our electronic cyber assets, then you don't need certain controls. So we work with the same vendor that will provide us with energy management system as one that will also provide us with something, a different solution that doesn't connect to our sensitive cyber assets. So you really want to narrow that down with your information security team. And they do so by going through a questionnaire with our business area folks. And like I said, starting with the simple stuff of what are we sharing? How are they connecting? What access do they have? And then we build those requirements out in the contract.
Okay, great, thanks. So really kind of driven by that business process, sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Frank, let me switch over to you and ask. So I like that model of the language in the contract should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Hopefully that's not too narrow of a target to be aiming for. But I guess, do you have an example of something that was either made too simple or too complicated?
And I think, again, I'll compliment Jacob and Miso because, yeah. So if you have a contractual agreement that specifies in kind of blanket form the granular type of remote access required for IT remote access, but it's written in a blanket form to apply throughout all of the technology stack. Perhaps you're not contemplating the existence of industrial protocols, et cetera. It creates interesting redlining needs. Basically, I think allow that information technology team, as Jacob mentioned, to define the particular needs of a particular engagement, and that can flow downstream. The supplier may simply need to agree that they will conform to all of the requirements required by the customer, but not try to set every single one of those forth in a contract. Rather, you can simply require the contractor, the supplier, the vendor to comply with requirements to be announced, but not specify them in some blanket agreement that may exist for years. Technologies are going to change, tools will change, and so trying to spell all of that out in the four corners of a contract that may, or a purchase agreement that may last for 3 to 5 years, or is probably definitely actually suboptimal. Don't do that. And instead make it open, but rigid enough that as the customer that you are going to be delivered exactly what you expect and what you need.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Hey, Jacob, kind of a follow-up to that, actually. When you go through that process of defining something, I mean, so yeah, there's a real clear balance between needing to be specific enough that you're going to get what you need and flexible enough that you have that ability to sort of change with the times over the life of the relationship. Do you end up using language like must do this or just should do this? Are you kind of defining things like you have sort of a narrow list of absolutely must haves? You must, I don't know, have certain capabilities that will end up, without those, it is a deal breaker.
Well, yeah. So if it's in the contract, it's a must.
Okay.
The should haves and all that other stuff is really in the RFP. And if you don't get the shoulds, then that's what you escalate to management to determine whether the risk is acceptable to the organization. You can also mitigate. So you address they should have this, but they don't actually do it. They do something different. So we're going to mitigate on our end. It's acceptable. We don't have to have it, which is why it's a should. So then you actively mitigate that, and we document that throughout the procurement process so that it flows. There's a circle loop, a loop back to the business to ensure that we actually mitigate what was not addressed.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jacob. Scott, I'll give you kind of a, it's not really a real world example, but I mean, there have been some close to this. If you specify in an art or in a legal agreement that every device must support Azure Active Directory, now called Intra, a protective relay isn't going to do that, and you don't want it to do that. You don't want it, authenticating to a cloud service. So it's things like that occasionally creep into agreements that really should be scrutinized before it ever gets to a negotiating table, because then you get into this explanation with sometimes with folks that don't really understand what it is that's being negotiated. So the basically it's prescriptive as necessary without becoming overly prescriptive or overly generalized. That is the key. And ultimately it just costs money because you're paying for the time of professionals that have to go back and forth and to be efficient. And it can seem like you're actually enhancing security, but you're actually not. You're costing both sides cycle time that could be used for more productive efforts.
Yeah, no, great. I think that sounds like a really good example of the potential hang up of using a sort of pre-established list that you're just going to include on everything without thinking too hard about it.
And that's a great point. That's actually, I think, where most of this comes from is there's a set of internal requirements, usually, especially in this sector, usually born from information technology controls, and then they'll be applied inside a more interior network. Not to say that there's, that security controls aren't absolutely essential inside, quote unquote, operational technology, but often they're not the same. And often you don't even want them to be the same because of the insulation that must be present inside protected enclaves.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll just add to that. You really can't underestimate the amount of time that goes into the back and forth over this stuff. So it's really important to be as surgical as possible, as accurate as possible with your vendor of what your actual needs are. And instead of just throwing, a lot of requirements that are unnecessary over the fence, snowflake requirements for your organization that are needed for certain solutions, but not others. So those will bounce back between organizations for months. So it's important to be accurate upfront.
Yeah, no, fair. And Snowflake is in the kind of cloud data processing one, for example, as one example. So I remember I saw in a real world example where, a company was looking to contract for a software as a service that was going to be aligned to Google Cloud, and the contract had their security requirements for Azure. So it's just, a subtle thing, but just like an easy kind of detail to overlook without being accurate, like you said. So I guess that's kind of getting into a question I wanted to ask you. In previous webinars, we've talked about the importance of things like defensible architecture and secure remote access. And so you end up with some really technical controls to enforce those, as well as, the policy things. I guess I just want to check, do you spell that out, those kind of requirements out in the RFP? I guess that struck me as potentially a risk of divulging too much information about your own internal operations. So sort of maybe the question is, how do you end up aligning these sort of administrative controls in an RFP to make sure that you're getting something that is capable of integrating with your technical controls at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's a good question. Our RFPs are not public. So when we do require like certain architecture configurations or stuff of that sensitive nature, we will have NDAs in place with our vendors and be very selective in who we talk to about those needs.
And just to amplify that, that's exactly that is the best practice. When anything is going to be divulged about, internal architecture, topology, that always occurs under NDA, and it should be treated by the supplier as customer confidential, and then destroyed if there's no further need for the information. In general, and that's where that collaborative relationship comes into play. In general, these aren't just abstract RFIs that you go to a website and find and kind of bid on them. Generally, there should be, especially when it's down into that layer of trust, a pre-existing relationship where some of that is collaborative anyway, and that it's also the responsibility of the supplier not to bid on something for which they are wholly or partially even, I'll say, unqualified, because the technology they are proposing isn't even going to interface with the needs of the customer. And that comes down to competence, expertise, and again, that trust and long-term relationship building, especially in this type of industry.
Yeah. Okay, Frank, one more follow-up for you then. So I kind of fascinated by this tension between, as a vendor, you end up having to manage relationships with multiple different utilities. I think they're each going to have probably their own idiosyncrasies. I guess, can you talk about that from a vendor perspective of how utilities best approach a vendor through that long-term relationship to sort of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I thought Jacob put it very eloquently, and that is, to the maximum extent possible, for a customer, and again, we're customers to each other, and we struggle with this too, in terms of, hey, we're special supplier, we need this, we're different. Generally, if there's an industry consortium, participate in it, understand it, voice those things that you believe that the common wisdom is not answering. But the more bespoke, the more customized requirements that you want to, we're different. We need to know about every vulnerability within 3 days. That is really counter to the good of the community, if you will, to the good of the whole ecosystem. And that's what's going to result in what Jacob just described as expensive, costly, and prolonged negotiation, because quite frankly, no one can really agree to that in terms of that level of private disclosure, just as an example. But yet and still, if you explain it, suppliers writ large want and need to please the customer. They want to do that. So if you have that so-called idiosyncratic need, bring it forth, explain it, and suppliers will bend over backwards, if at all possible, unless they're not discharging their responsibility to other customers. It will be accommodated. But explaining the why, defining exactly what you need and why, will speed that conversation and negotiation, if that's what it's going to take.
Okay. Yeah, no, fair enough. I guess, Jacob, kind of similar question. Do you see any hangups of working with some vendors about sort of making sure that your specific kind of requirements are met? Kind of gets into our next topic for a future webinar, but sort of working with the vendor to make sure that they are, I guess, kind of like you talked about in your presentation about holding them accountable, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway is just be reasonable. Like Frank was talking about, if you're working with a vendor on a solution that is offered to hundreds, thousands of customers, you're not going to get a unique terms. So like vulnerability. But if you have a specific solution that you're working with the vendor on and they discover a vulnerability, then you want to work with them quickly and you want that sort of language in your contract. But being reasonable and understanding what you need and also explaining the why, like Frank mentioned, is important. It's important for the relationship. You'll get what you need if you really need it. And the vendor will also adjust and price accordingly. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So I think for the last question I have, I just wanted to kind of confirm, since you both mentioned the NATF criteria, so the NA in that is North America, but I've looked at it a little bit and it seems like it is really aligned with cybersecurity best practices overall, and therefore not specific to North America in terms of the actual internal criteria. It also looks like it's aligned to several of the international frameworks. There's mappings to IEC 62443 and ISO 27001. Do you see any sort of North America specific attributes to NATF, Jacob, and then Frank?
Yeah, I'll start. So there are two, I'll call them instruments. One is the criteria, and that's more, and there are 50 plus of those. That is a bit more oriented towards the NERC CIP 13 requirements, but the questionnaire is not. It will satisfy those, but no, I think you described it accurately, Scott. It is really global in its applicability, meaning that the questions are just good cybersecurity and physical security, hygiene and controls. It's a great measurement tool if the supplier does not already have, or maybe even if they do, but and certainly the big suppliers will provide answers to that questionnaire already. And I'm talking even on the IT side. So it is something that no one really is, I think, going to publish it on the website for download, because it does contain somewhat sensitive information about timelines, et cetera. But it is definitely available upon request. And it's something that you can freely download and use. And quite frankly, it's a good internal calibration tool also. It's like the CIS critical security controls, except it goes into more things that deal with physical security, vulnerability disclosure, and things that CIS isn't really going to touch.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. The alignment to the NERC CIP, that does seem to be the primary one. On that question, sorry, go, Jay, please.
I'll also add, so NERC CIP, again, focuses on the vendor's environment and their cybersecurity environment. It doesn't focus on the specific solution security. So something to also keep in mind.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Actually, and sort of related to that, I guess I wanted to follow up, Frank, on the Edison Electric Institute's procurement language. That also looked, tightly aligned to NERC CIP 13, which is the standard on supply chain security. But even then, it looked like, the list of requirements in that are not particularly specific to North America. You see that procurement language as potentially useful internationally, correct?
I absolutely do. And the only thing that you would need to potentially change, depending on where you are in the world, is maybe the NIST references, the National Institutes of Standard Technology references may not be as, although they too really aren't country specific, but perhaps that would be changed to an ISO standard. But yes, I do think that has international applicability also.
Okay. So when you mentioned something in there that sort of made me want to follow up in a previous answer, do you see major differences in RFPs or kind of the considerations for cybersecurity that you put into an RFP when it comes to an IT system versus an OT system, or is it really come down to sort of being accurate, sort of like Jacob said?
No, that's a good question. No, I don't think there. Yeah, it all comes down to being specific for the particular use case and being applicable to the system or product or service being described. And as long as that is accurate, then it becomes far more streamlined. It is when you have some blanket list of requirements for, let's say, an edge IT firewall, and you attempt to apply those same requirements to protective relay or recloser system. That's where when that becomes a bit of a puzzle to put together. And the more we can avoid that, the more efficient we all become, and the more secure we become, because that does no one, that doesn't aid anybody in the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal of this, obviously, is to keep each other safe. And so that really needs to be foremost in mind. And the fact that this is not one and done. You can have the most restrictive contract language in the world, but if the vendor's not doing it, it doesn't really matter. And your only recourse is to sue. And that's obviously not a winning thing for anybody.
Yeah, it's a relationship that's gotten a bit out of hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. No, fair enough. So Jacob, I think the genuinely final question to you, and then I'll let you both have a kind of final word if you want. But one thing I noticed in your slide, it seemed like the educate management was kind of down towards the end. I'm curious, can you talk to how involved the management is throughout the process? Are they kind of needed for approval? How aware are they? I think one thing we heard in a previous webinar was sort of, a place that you can get tripped up is not having centralized procurement. You end up sort of with a mishmash of requirements and not having that well coordinated.
Yeah, good question. So educate management is at the end. Management's engaged throughout, but really the educate management at the end is all about talking about the gaps, if there are any, between our requirements, what we want, and what the vendor can provide, what the vendor agrees to provide in writing in the contract. So then management will be the one to accept that risk. You don't want the risk acceptance at a low level, because then things might not get mitigated appropriately. So if it's accepted at the high level, then you're aware of the risk. You can focus on allocating resources with mitigation needs more effectively when those decisions are being made at a higher level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so I think that kind of aligns with a lot of things we've heard throughout the series and even in the previous series of, the importance of having that oversight. So I think I see we're at the top of the hour here. So I guess any final thoughts or words, Jacob and then Frank?
I'll just emphasize the importance of communicating your needs, your requirements up front early, so the vendors can let you know what they can provide, and what they can't provide, you might be able to mitigate on your end, so you plan. That's really the key takeaway from my end. Frank?
Yeah, I'll expand on that, Jacob, and that is that collaboration. It should be a continual process. For instance, we bring hundreds of suppliers to Eastern Washington, to Pullman, Washington every year. Host a 2-day conference and listen to them, explain our expectations, and give them the why behind what we expect and what they can expect from us. So that type of partnership is critical. It makes contract negotiation often a breeze because it's already known exactly what you should see, why we're asking, and if all of that is clear, then the language falls into place very easily. When it's not clear, that's when the head scratching and negotiation begins. And I think we've all seen legal instruments, legal vehicles, contracts. We're not even really sure what the ask is. So that's when it becomes more problematic and really expensive for all involved. Collaboration.
Perfect word to end on. So yeah, I really want to thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and experience. And so let me just close out with a couple notes here. The recording of today's webinar will be uploaded to USEA's YouTube channel, and a link will be added to the event along with PDFs of the presentation. And next up is the 10th and final webinar in the series, which will be held in 2 weeks on May 9th. And with that, we're going to try and cover some of this coordinating cybersecurity risk management with those vendors. So following the series, we will be developing a written handbook with the recording where we can capture the discussion points as well as links to resources like the ones presented today. To any webinars in the series, the USDA and previous webinars, links to the recordings. So thank you again for joining today, and hope to see you at the next webinar on May 9th. So Frank and Jacob, thank you again, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.